Hi, everyone. Welcome to Art and Ideas. This evening, we'll be hearing from Alec Blair for our lecture titled Enthusiasm and Understanding, Lawren Harris and Connections Beyond the Group. You will also see that I'm joined by a second guest. Thank you for being here again with us, Stew. Stew Sheppard is Lawren Harris's grandson, and he will be joining in at the end of the talk this evening for the Q&A portion. If you missed the discussion that took place last week, I invite you to watch the recording. You can find it now on the gallery's website, which is jnag.ca, jnaag.ca. My name is Sonia Blazek, and I'm the curator at the Judith and Norman Alex Art Gallery, and I'll be mediating the Q&A portion of the talk and managing the technical aspects of the evening. As some of you know, I met both Alec and Stu through the Lawren Harris inventory project. The gallery was contributing high resolution images of the Lawren Harris paintings that we have in our permanent collection to their database. And from there, we struck up a really rich conversation, which inspired me instantly to bring both Alec and Stu to everyone to enjoy. So Alec and Stu are located in British Columbia. Thank you for joining us from the Pacific time zone. Yeah. Alec is a landscape painter. He is a lecturer also in the geography department at the University of British Columbia. He teaches courses in the environmental and sustainability program. He is also the director of the Lawren S. Harris inventory project, working with the estate of the artist to put together a catalog of the artist's work. This is an ongoing project, and it is currently in the research stage. And to date, the project has amassed more than 1,300 works. As you guys know, all of our lectures complement or expand on ideas that are found in our exhibitions. And tonight we pull threads from our Group of Seven exhibition and look at the influence that Lawren Harris had on female artists of his time, with special attention given to his connection to Emily Carr. This deep dive into the Harris-Carr relationship is made possible in part to rare surviving letters, which we have to thank Stu for. Thank you so much for providing those to Alec for tonight's presentation.
Pleasure.
At this time, I want to invite you to look at the bottom of your screen. You should find a Q&A function there. If you have any questions, please feel free to bring that up, put your questions in as the conversation goes on this evening. At the end of the talk, once Alec finishes, I will pull up the questions and read them out, and we'll answer any that are outstanding. I'm so pleased to welcome you guys both back this week. Thank you for being here.
No problem. Thank you very much, Sonia, and thank you for hosting us both this week and last week. It was a lot of fun to get to share a lot of stuff that I find intriguing about Harris's work, and hopefully this week we'll delve into some more stuff that's interesting, and it's a little bit different, but anyway, I'll get into that. So let me share my screen here, and we can get started. So that's clear. Everyone can see that, and that's full screen. All good. Perfect. Well, thank you, everyone, for hosting us in your homes, and hope that everyone's doing well here. This week, what I want to talk about, and I spent a lot of time last week, obviously, talking about the trajectory of Harris's career, focusing on some of the works in the collection there at the JNAG, and that Sarnia has held as part of their collection for decades, almost a century for some of them. And what I wanted to focus on today is a little bit different. It'll still be focused, centralized around Harris, of course, because that's what I spend a lot of time thinking about and looking at, certainly. But one of the things that I wanted to take the opportunity to do was explore some of his connections beyond just his own work to other artists that were his contemporaries, that were his peers, that were his friends, and we're on this sort of artistic mission alongside him, or at least parallel to him, I think. So just in case anyone is not familiar with Harris, this is a picture of him here in the 1940s at his home in Vancouver, where he spent the last 30 years of his life, and that's a work from probably the late 20s there on the left, a Rocky Mountain piece. Most of what we do with the work for this inventory project involves sort of technical stuff, if you will, looking at where he painted, when he painted, what he painted, categorizing it, cataloging it, trying to get some insight into his methods, etc. But of course, this all intersects with a broader context. The impact of the work in Canadian cultural history and contemporary art here in Canada, the legacy of his work, and sort of increasingly these days, reconciling our current perspective on things like identification with the environment, on who's represented in Canadian culture and who is maybe over or underrepresented, and trying to, in some ways, come to terms with issues of privilege and issues of balance and diversity, expansion of that, all sorts of things. And I think that that's a common thread that runs through a lot of current shows, certainly with last year, 2020 being the 100th anniversary of the first Group of Seven show. There was not only a celebration of that 100 years, but also a concurrent examination of the works in context and trying to, in some ways, use that, you could call it privilege or popularity or whatever, that the Group of Seven have been afforded in their prominence in Canadian culture over the last 100 years, to also use that moment as a way to examine other artists, and often in particular artists that were more marginalized or less celebrated. I think coming to that in part is appropriate, sort of pursuing that is appropriate for the inventory project, because it's also something that I think Harris would have genuinely supported. He was very supportive of other Canadian artists. I was looking through these letters between him and Carr. I also was looking through some other letters, and you see letters from him in the 1940s from art galleries or communications with art galleries that are wanting to buy some of his canvases. And one of the arrangements, at least, that he had with Museum London in Ontario and also with the AGO was he would charge them for the picture. So he would sell a canvas for, say, $300, I think one of them I saw. But the money, instead of taking the money, he would ask that it be used directly to buy contemporary Canadian art. So it would be directly used to build the Canadian art collection, not just his own art contributing to that, but also a broader spectrum of Canadian art. And so recognizing that we all have our own biases and our own sort of approaches to ideas about the environment, ideas about art history, ideas about Canadian culture, and of course, including my own privilege in being able to spend a lot of time looking at this stuff and talking about it, I think we can hopefully address some of the issues that we'll talk about in this talk here in a constructive and inclusive way that builds up this sort of canon of Canadian art and helps to broaden our appreciation of it and the way that we value it. And certainly that includes not shying away from critical analysis of failures of history and institutional systemic issues that we've seen, particularly in a time of reconciliation, that is important, but also moving through that with appropriate complexity and sensitivity to the fact that there's a lot of different angles to consider here. So, and I apologize, this talk starts off a little bit more academically than my last one, but it will quickly get into exploration with plenty of nice pictures. One of the things that today is also April 22nd, it's also Earth Day. And one of the parallels that comes up in a lot of my other work when considering, let's say, narrower approaches towards ideas, whether it's culture or ideas like nature or wilderness, is embodied in a paper from 25 years ago by William Cronin, which is a very important paper in the field of environment and sustainability or conservation, which is tangentially related to what we're talking about. But Cronin 25 years ago argued about this problematic ideal of wilderness that separated people from their environment. And he argued that wilderness is a state of mind rather than a fact of nature, and it has a lot to do with wonder. This paper was not so well received. It was argued by many that he was rejecting national parks and this sort of separation or the wonder that people might feel when outside of human-dominated areas. But he was pretty clear that that's not necessarily a problem. Wilderness is only a problem if we imagine that this experience of wonder and otherness is somehow limited to remote corners of the planet, and that it somehow depends on pristine landscapes that we do not inhabit. And what he called for was using the inspiration of wilderness to allow us to recognize wonder in our daily lives and in broader, more expanded opportunities of interactions with nature and interactions with others. And I think there's a lovely parallel here that can be drawn to the art of someone celebrating Canadian culture like Harris or even Carr, in that the celebration of this sort of ideal can be extremely powerful in it, not just standing alone, and maybe if it stands alone, it is narrow or myopic, but if it can be expanded to lead to other explorations and lead to broader appreciations, then it can be extremely valuable. So that's just a little parallel. And I think with today being Earth Day, I was thinking a lot about this and a lot about the works and their depictions of ideas of wilderness or ideas of the environment here in Canada. And I think there's a lot that they still have to offer, and that a lot that they have to bridge this gap between where we live and the wider context that we do that living in. So that is a bit of a maybe slightly, maybe has more of a place in one of my university courses, but I think it sets the scene a little bit here for what we're going to talk about, which is one of the things that I'm interested in. Of course, Harris, being a very prominent artist in Canada, has a lot of contemporaries that are well known, particularly the Group of Seven and Tom Thompson, who sort of are part and parcel in their celebrity with him. But there were a lot of other contemporaries that they were involved with, that they were friends with, that showed with them, and that in 1933, when the Group of Seven disbanded and reformed as the Canadian Group of Painters, were included in that expanded, more diverse, more inclusive, though obviously not entirely inclusive, form of artistic collaboration. So these are just two pictures from the Canadian Group of Painters inaugural exhibition in 1933. Harris was the first president of the Canadian Group of Painters, but there are many familiar names, and some of the artists that we'll talk about today, their work can be seen here, including Carr there, Anne Savage, Yvonne McKeag-Hauser there, Bess Harris, Harris's wife, is there, and then other artists, Thoreau MacDonald, W.P. Weston. There's a range of representation here that covered a bit broader spectrum of the country rather than focusing mostly on Ontario, and particularly a more balanced gender representation, at least. So what I would like to do is just take a few of these artists, and particularly ones that contributed to Group of Seven shows in the 1920s, to explore a little bit about their work and make some connections to what Harris was doing and the ways in which his work informed theirs, but also was appreciated likely by him and contemporaries that appreciated all of these artists' works. We'll only cover a couple because I want to spend a fair amount of time focusing on Emily Carr because of the insight we can gain from their correspondence, but there are a few other interesting points that can come up here with a few of the other artists. So the first one, Yvonne McKeag-Hauser, was a Toronto artist in the 1920s. She was one of the founding members of the Canadian Group of Painters in 1933. I already pointed out her work in that show. And she exhibited with the Group of Seven in 1928, in 1930, in 1931 as well. She's probably most well known for her depictions of Cobalt, Ontario, mining town there, which you may have seen depictions of by also Frank Carmichael or several other artists. Also, Bess Harris also depicted it. But this picture from the National Gallery is probably one of her most famous works. She did also, though, go sketching in the North Shore of Lake Superior. And in 1980, she wrote a wonderful, succinct article about that experience that illuminates the sort of role, or at least the presence of Harris and in the minds of fellow artists that were exploring a lot of the same subjects and a lot of the same inspiration, being the Canadian landscape. So she wrote, "My first glimpse of the North Shore of Lake Superior was from a train. I sat with my nose pressed against the dirty window and marveled at how Lawren Harris had caught the extraordinary light and feeling of bigness that makes that part of Canada unique. I made some pencil notes and vowed that one day I would paint there. And sure enough, not that long after, she went there with Isabel McLaughlin, another artist. They said they had a little bit of trouble finding places to stay because it was a little bit harder. I think what she mentions in the article is that young women traveling alone were viewed somewhat suspiciously at that time, but they managed to find a place to stay at the YMCA, and it didn't sound particularly comfortable or particularly enjoyable in her recollection. And you could find it in the journal Northward in 1980 if you want to read more. But it was very productive for her artistically, and she did several sketches and subsequent large canvases of the town of Rossport, which is on the North Shore of Lake Superior. So the top two pictures here are two of her canvases, one in the National Gallery, one in Museum London, that depict Rossport. And what we can point out here is that there was similarity in where people in the 1920s and the 1930s, particularly around Ontario, went to paint, which was based on access via railroads. So both of these top paintings are from Rossport, which is where these artists were paintings. On the bottom, you can see two other pictures from Rossport, one by George Pepper and one by Harris, the Harris one done in 1921. Really interestingly is that in the two lower ones, you can see that they've even painted the same building. 5 years apart on totally separate trips. They were friendly, but you do see a lot of this overlap of subject matter, which I think, I always say this, is really interesting. I do just find so much of this stuff very interesting, but it's really neat to see these different depictions of the same location and being able to compare them. So I think that that helps with recognizing the multitude of visions of the Canadian landscape and what's emphasized in some and what is left out of others. There is a particularly interesting passage, or a few more interesting passages from the article, talking about waking up at Rossport. McKeag writes, "Soon the sky showed a little light. Never will I forget the glory of that sunrise. I cannot describe it. The experience was unique. Lawren Harris did it in some of his paintings. Every now and then as the sun rose and penetrated the mist, it was as though a searchlight pinpointed one composition after another." And of course, you can see this depicted in one of the many sketches Harris did on the North Shore that she would have been familiar with. The perhaps most comical selection of the article comes near the end when she talks about another artist, Roddy Cordes, joining them. They decided to climb up to try and find a high vantage point overlooking the town and sort of out to the lake. It was a little bit cloudy. It didn't exactly work for them, but then they found a tiny bottle of gin in their paint boxes there. And after drinking it, they had an inspiration. Let's build a still life of Lawren Harris. They dragged a dead bare small tree trunk and some branches onto bare rock and propped them up with logs and rocks that were lying near us. And they made a couple sketches. And they later said, and this is how the article closed off, "Both of us did large canvases from these bogus sketches. And when I last spoke to Roddy just before she died, I said, that was pretty disgraceful, wasn't it? She smiled and said, and worse still, we sold them." I don't think there's anything necessarily disgraceful about it, but it's really interesting to sort of see this outcome here. And what we can see, it's hard to say exactly which of these sketches. These three are by Yvonne McKeag-Hauser. This one's by Roddy Cordes, which I couldn't find a good one potentially depicting it, but this is of her trip to Lake Superior there. But you can see, I think maybe this one could be it. You can see these don't exactly look like the most robust of trees. But somewhere out there, there are the relevant sketches and perhaps canvases that relate to this sort of very intentional compositional echoing of what Harris had highlighted and what Harris had become known for in very short time in Toronto art circles, at least, for depicting. As I mentioned last time, Harris went through subjects very quickly, altering where his focus was and moving on very quickly. You know, a couple years and he would move on to the next subject. Focused on Algoma and urban scenes very quickly, moving to Lake Superior, the Rocky Mountains. Only went to the Rocky Mountains for 5 years, really, and then moved on and painted, and then moved on to the Arctic, and then finally into abstraction. So interesting that it would have such an impact and be so immediately recognizable as a Lawren Harris subject, even at that point in time in the mid-1920s. Of course, the commonalities between artistic approaches went further than just Lake Superior. On the left here are two pictures by Harris of the Lake O'Hara region, and on the right, two pictures by Yvonne McCaig-Hauser. So you can see slightly different angles and slightly different vantage points, but same subject. So on the top, Cathedral Mountain, all this is in the Lake O'Hara region in Yoho National Park, and on the bottom, Mount Oderey there. So you do see this sort of echoing of subjects, not necessarily intentionally, and there's no clear designation. I don't know the dates for these McCaig-Hauser sketches, but when we look at Doris Mills in a moment, we'll see that it's possible she even painted some of these subjects before Harris, though she was obviously influenced by his style. But you just tend to see a lot of overlap, which provides a lot of connections. And you can imagine the types of conversations and the types of sharing that I talked about a little bit before going on in Algoma when there was a collective of artists working together that Harris would organize. You can imagine back in Toronto with the exhibitions, people invited contributors exhibiting, and then also visits to studios, etc. You can imagine the types of discussions and the types of working through the sort of conversations about working through the problems and challenges of sketching in the Canadian landscape that might have occurred. Another very prominent Canadian landscape artist from the 20th century, Anne Savage, who was from Montreal, another founding member of the Canadian Group of Painters. She was also a founding member of the Beaver Hall Group. There is a painting in, I believe, the collection of the Jane Egg by Anne Savage as well, that I think is on display right now. She exhibited as well with the Group of Seven, 1926 and 1931. She also exhibited at the West Coast Art Show in 1927, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a moment, which is the first time that Carr and Harris met each other. But there's an interesting passage that we get from Anne Savage about her visiting Harris's studio in the mid-20s, again emphasizing some of his Lake Superior works, saying, and this is maybe around 1924 or 1925, he showed me panels of Lake Superior with huge black stems of trees and a definite feeling of dignity and control. There's nothing out of place. I remember thinking, isn't this extraordinary, and couldn't analyze it. But after I came back, I realized he was abstracting the subject. He was on his way to just shooting off into this world of nothing but light and air. There's a typo there, I apologize. But you can see these pictures here. These are pictures from 1923, probably 1922, 1923, that Harris would have painted at Lake Superior. And you can understand perhaps what she's talking about, and the experience of visiting the studio obviously would have an impact. Harris, and this is pushing forward a little in time to the discussions with Carr, but I think probably reflects the way he would have approached other artists coming to visit his studio. Obviously was quite welcoming to that, but didn't seem particularly comfortable with giving direct instruction or criticism even. He writes to Carr, who was asking for feedback on her paintings, "I believe all through myself in encouraging everybody, and hope and pray I may never grow so sad in soul as to lose that belief. But I don't believe much in criticism, and don't often believe that my perceptions are good enough to be of use to others. When I see the work of someone that lacks individuality, I can suggest to that individual that they strive to see for themselves work to elicit their own inner vision and inner thrill. But when I see work of an individualist, what can I say or anyone say but keep on?" And this greatly echoes what Harris would say to Carr over and over again, and why her work really resonated with him, was that she was clearly extremely original. And I think Anne Savage coming to see his work in the studio, likely he would have expressed the same message. And a couple years after she visited his studio, you could see her work from the Skeena River in British Columbia. Certainly on the top pictures there, you maybe see some echoes of that stylistic device of these dead trees there being the focal point, or being perhaps somewhat of a screen in front of a distant, in this case, mountain. But you can also see her really going her own way, but following up on this same idea of abstracting the landscape. And she was phenomenal in the ways that she abstracted the landscape. Her work, I think, these are on relatively tiny panels, and really, really exciting works, I think. Really, really neat. So Harris, in this sense, was connected to artists and not trying to shape how they work necessarily beyond just encouraging the direct individual connection to the landscape and the direct expression of those connections. I think Anne Savage's drawings as well, I believe these are in the collection of the National Gallery, a full notebook of all her pencil drawings from the Skeena River trip that are just fantastic. In pattern and in design, wonderful to explore and to enjoy. So very much taking this idea of abstraction, taking it this time further in a lot of ways than Harris had, somewhat decorative, but definitely abstracted, maybe not decorative, just flat in a sense. And really, really exciting work that clearly was in the same spirit as what Harris was trying to achieve. Final artist that I want to talk a little bit about before getting to Emily Carr is Doris Mills, who I think is the most underrepresented artist of all of the ones that I'll talk about today in terms of public collections, or even in her recognition, certainly in the marketplace or in private collections. She tends to have flown under the radar, but the work that she did was very closely related to the work of the Group of Seven. She was very close to them, very good friends with Bess Hauser, later who became Bess Harris. She shared space in the studio building with Thoreau MacDonald, J.H. MacDonald's son. And she exhibited with the Group of Seven, 1926, 28, 1930, 1931. Also really important for the work we do with the inventory, she was the one who was tasked with typing up and sort of organizing and naming, essentially, if you want to call it that, all of the works that Harris had left behind when he left Canada in 1934 for New Hampshire. So all of the Algoma sketch, 32, or any northern painting 6/2, anything like that came from the Mills inventorying of it. I don't have a picture of Doris Mills, unfortunately, but this is one of her paintings here on the right, an oil on beaver board sketch, very similar in approach to the way that Harris would have sketched outside, also similar in style, certainly to Thoreau MacDonald. And on the left here, you can see a picture of her living room, actually from 1931, with a wonderful Harris canvas that was on loan at the time to her, hanging there on the wall. So certainly a very neat and very much integral part of this scene, I think. And we can look at the work that she did and find some really obvious parallels to the sort of style that Harris would have been depicting at the time, and that many would have connected with this sort of school of painting. I don't know the exact location for these two paintings. This one's called Salt Marsh. These may be Lake Superior works. It's hard to say. They certainly are very related to the type of work that Harris was doing around Lake Superior, but could really be anywhere. This one's particularly interesting. It came up for auction a few years ago, but it has the contemporary frame, the same Boughton, really, really nice frame that Harris would have been using in the 20s. It was framed at the time. Really, really neat work that, I think is representative of some of the just the contemporary consciousness, collective consciousness that was going around, certainly Toronto, at least at the time. People going to these shows, showing in these Group of Seven shows, not necessarily getting the same recognition, but definitely a part of the same scene. One of the weirder things is Doris Mills has a few paintings in some collections. You saw one there from McMichael. She's got a couple in the Art Gallery of Toronto, but one of the two of the stranger ones, or Art Gallery of Ontario now, sorry, it was the Art Gallery of Toronto. Two of the stranger ones are these two works on the bottom here, which are actually painted on the verso on the back of these two early Harris works. So these are two very early Harris sketches, small, probably from 1908 to 1912, sometime in there, probably in the Laurentians. And on the verso, Mills, obviously, she owned a couple more of these early sketches as well, but she obviously felt that the boards didn't need to fully go to waste. And so she painted these on the backs of them. So you sort of have this inseparable connection between the two that is really fascinating. Unfortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, you can't display both at the same time, I don't think. So I think that there's some sort of affixing here that's been done to probably put it into the frame by whoever prioritized the Harris works over the Verso Mills works, but very interesting sort of stuff. And of course, similar to Yvonne McKeag-Hauser, you can see a trip to the Rockies that Doris Mills took in 1926. This on the right here is a picture of Lake MacArthur by Mills. This on the left is a picture by Harris of MacArthur. The Mills one's done in 1926. Hard to say exactly when Harris did that. Maybe 1926, maybe a little bit later. Very similar. This is obviously a very, or not obviously, it is a very common location for people to paint to. It's an iconic subject in Canadian art, certainly. But you can really see that these are contemporaries worthy of conversation and of dialogue between the two works and certainly the two artists. Similarly, you've got here a picture close by in Yoho National Park. This one is the Mills one in the top right. She also did a canvas based on this. These two are Harris paintings, and this one's a J.H. MacDonald painting of the same Schaefer Lake and Mount Schaefer there. So you can see, as we saw before with Hauser, that you do have this sort of overlap based on areas that were accessible, areas where there were lodges, but also perhaps word of mouth. I mean, Lake O'Hara is an extremely pleasant place to be, and certainly J.H. MacDonald was fairly vocal about his desire to spend whatever afterlife he had, if there was one, in the Lake O'Hara version in heaven or some type of approximation of that. So there's no doubt that these areas would have had a fairly good reputation back in Toronto when artists came back from visiting there, and certainly a popular place. But really neat to see that in some cases you get these identical sort of vantage points, of course, because the same hikes were there, the same sort of trails were there, and you get this wonderful comparison of all these different depictions of these areas, the different ways that the landscape was abstracted or simplified in order to approach the challenges of painting in the Canadian landscape. So those are a few artists that we can sort of relate to Harris throughout the 1920s and into the 30s, certainly sharing exhibitions and in many cases a part of the Canadian Group of Painters. But there's probably no other artist outside of the Group of Seven that Harris was more identified with or more connected to than Emily Carr. And these are both pictures here of, they're both in a way, each individual picture is a picture of Carr and Harris. In one sense, on the left is a picture of Emily Carr in her studio with a Lawren Harris painting on the wall. And on the right is a picture of Lawren Harris with Ira Dilworth with several Emily Carr canvases on the wall behind them. They first met at this exhibition of Canadian West Coast art in December 1927. Carr had not been painting regularly for many years, for maybe 10 or 15 years she hadn't been painting, but she was invited to contribute her works, primarily from 1912, 1913, to this show depicting the West Coast that was going to be held in Ottawa. And you can see here from the catalog, she contributed 26 works, and conveniently for the screenshot, Lawren Harris also was on the same page of the catalog there depicted, and he contributed a group of Rocky Mountain sketches, which were displayed as well. This was the first time that they encountered one another and that they met, and Carr was able to come visit for the show, and we'll talk a little bit about her visit and the impression it made. These are some pictures of the exhibition. You can see here on the bottom, it's a range of Indigenous art and settler colonial depictions of the West Coast. You've got Emily Carr paintings here on the bottom picture. You've got an Edward Holgate here. Apparently this is a picture of one of the central rooms. Off to the side on the right is where there were some Jackson sketches displayed from the Rockies. And on the left is where there were the Harris sketches, which unfortunately that room was not photographed. But we can see 3 tiny sketches here, which if you zoom in really close, you could start to identify 2 of them maybe. So one of them, so this is obviously how I spend some of my evenings, just really delving in here and going through the sketches. You can see here, this is a picture above Moraine Lake of Sentinel Pass, I believe. So you can see very clearly from some of the shapes here, this lake and et cetera, et cetera. This is one of the sketches he displayed. That's very helpful because it allows us to place this in time, that this was done by 1927. This other sketch, I mean, this one, come on, there's no way I can get that. Unfortunately, you got a little bit of land that very, very tough. Maybe someday. This one, surprisingly tricky also. Little piece of land. Unfortunately, the interesting thing is there's no land in the bottom left corner here. And if you look at all these Harris sketches, all these ones all have land in the bottom left corner. It's very rare that you get a picture without that. So there is one where I don't have a picture of it, but that I believe is a good match. We've got the pencil sketch and we've got the drawing here that was from the Mills inventory. Now, Mills didn't do these drawings herself. She had another artist, Hans Jensen, do them. But anyway, it's from that 1934 inventory. You can see that there was a panel done based on this pencil sketch. You can see that these shapes here do line up, and I've gone through a lot of the other works. It's almost certainly this work here that was displayed on the wall there. This one, still a mystery. So we can identify two of the works, unclear exactly how many Harris displayed, and certainly I don't think anytime soon we're going to get any clear answers on that, but just a little, investigation into that. Emily Carr does visit the Harris home, as evidenced by perhaps the challenges of that previous investigation. There are abundant challenges in trying to, as I mentioned before, date Harris works, and also sort of figure out which ones were exhibited where, because there weren't a lot of records that were kept, particularly by the artist himself. What we do tend to have are in shows, reviews of them, but also descriptions perhaps by other artists, and none more so than Carr have come up as wonderful sources. So this is a picture that happened to be from a magazine, Canadian Home and Living, I believe, depicting the Harris house in 1927, which is around the same time, or maybe 1928, when Carr visited the Harris home. And she describes it in her journals, which are hugely useful. I have a well-used copy of Hundreds and Thousands, where she talks about all the paintings that were in Harris's house, and the Tom Thompson that was there, the A.Y. Jackson Edge of the Maple Wood that was there that she saw. But you can see here, and I've just taken this one and overlaid the actual picture so you get a bit of a sense of what it looked like there. But there's wonderful descriptions of all the paintings that Harris had in his house that were really making an impact on her. And all these pictures, it's unclear in some of these cases. There's two mountain and snow canvases, so we don't know exactly which one was in there, but this was in one of the rooms. She talks about these sort of golden hued autumn shore scenes that were depicted where reflections were hard to distinguish from the shoreline. She talks about having these two canvases in the living room paired, and a very clear description of this, now what's called Lake Superior 3 in the Thompson collection. And then this little panel we saw in that photo there. She talked about all these works, and it allows us a little bit of insight into what she was exposed to and what influenced her, what inspired her so much about these works. And also just interesting about where Harris and his family were at in terms of their appreciation of the works and in terms of how they lived with them. Also really neat is her description of visiting Harris's studio. Now, there are no great pictures that I know of Harris's studio when he was working in there, but he was in the studio building, very similar then to this picture here of Jackson in the studio building. These huge windows in this building that Harris funded in 1914 that had 6 different big studios in it, similar to that. Went to Harris's studio. She talks about how wonderful it was in there, and she describes the work working on a big canvas, rock forms in deep purples with 3 large rocks. The sky was wonderful. Cloud shafts of strong sun pierced down the rocks, and straight, wide beams made a glowing pool of pure light. This describes a work that I showed last week as well, very familiar. So this was being worked on, we now know, in December 1927 when Carr was visiting Harris in her studio. And he explains the way that he gets, quote, vibrations into his paintings, sort of this sense of the color almost being alive by putting linseed oil directly onto the canvas, painting into that, using retouching varnish on his darks, on his dark colors afterwards to ensure that they don't sort of sink in too much. All these tips that she in her journals is very appreciative for, and is just thrilled to be getting this insight into the process and also being exposed to these works that she's really excited about. We can't tell for sure exactly what mountain canvas she's talking about in this depiction here, but it could be this one, or it could be one potentially that was destroyed. She talks about over the mantle, there's a huge canvas of a mighty mountain mass. The fifth time he has worked it out and still he's unsatisfied and wants to do another canvas of it, et cetera, et cetera. And as the long cold greens he gets, it's a superb subject. So it could be this one. Maybe he destroyed it and did another one. It says here it was the fifth time that he was trying it. A bit unclear as to whether or not any of those or how many of those survived the time that he was working on it, or how many were destroyed. But it does give some insight into what Harris was working on at the time. And finally, this drawing on the left here, he showed me a black and white sketch inspired by a coal strike in Halifax. This description of this gaunt, agonized woman and her pitiful, drooping, hopeless child. The background houses black and desolate. There was a thunderous, stupendous horror in the air. The woman's eyes were wild and frantic. Someday he will make a canvas of it. It will be terrific. Unfortunately, that we know of, Harris didn't paint a full canvas of this exact scene. He did paint one of Glace Bay there on the right, which is the same location and just a slightly different composition. But he didn't end up painting this one that we know of. But one can imagine it would have been quite impactful if he had. Obviously had some intention to do so, or at least Carr interpreted that he did. And finally, she talks about going to an exhibition in Montreal where this painting, which is now in the collection of the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts, was on display. She sat and watched it for a long time. She wished she could sweep the rest of the wall bare. And the people that weren't appreciating it, how I longed to slap them, which I think, gives a little bit of insight into Carr's personality, perhaps. She certainly did seem to have not the most patience for everyone in that she came across, but clearly extremely moved by this work and was lamenting the fact that others weren't appreciating it, what she saw as a truly fantastic and impressive piece of art. So Carr has this initial trip. On that trip, early on, Harris says to Carr, "You are one of us," and that, according to her journals, really means a lot to her. And they do continue this relationship, this friendship over the years. And they write each other letters, and that's what I've had the pleasure of going through. You can see this is one of the letters that didn't really get off the ground. Just "Dear Emily," and then Harris somehow got distracted by some clouds and just did a picture. So that one never mailed. But otherwise, they did have a lot of correspondence. We've got a lot of the letters that Harris sent to Carr that we can look at to get some insight into their relationship. And while we don't have the letters coming back from Carr to Harris, we do have her thoughts in her journals that sort of piece together this whole thing. She did exhibit with the Group of Seven in 1930 and 31. In 1928, she was considered for exhibiting with them. She didn't, but it was a possibility, except for the fact that the West Coast Art Show overlapped with it, the Montreal showing. So her paintings that were back east already, or out east, were otherwise occupied. She again was a founding member of the Canadian Group of Painters as well. And it's obvious that initially, and there are a few things. There's also an artist, Mark Toby, that Harris in the late 20s was working with, that influenced her treatment of particularly volume and of her style. But obviously Harris and the sort of planes, that light-filled planes that she saw in his work, had a big impact on her. You can see this work here on the left of this raven holding a totem pole showing a raven holding a copper in its mouth. You can see that it has sort of a background that would be well in place in a Lawren Harris abstract, even. So almost foreshadowing this the style that Lawren Harris would eventually turn to. It's quite an abstracted sky there, done in 1928 or 29 by Carr. You can see I've just taken this and changed the orientation a bit. It's almost remarkable. This was a painting done almost 10 years later, probably 1937, by Harris when he was in the United States. But if you just take little pieces of it, it would be almost, almost interchangeable, these types of colors and this sort of geometric arrangement that could be found in both of these, which is fascinating. I think it speaks to their similarity in aesthetic appreciation, perhaps, or sort of the resonance, the fact that they resonated perhaps with the same things. Harris provided advice to Carr through these letters. I mean, it certainly initially had a very sort of mentor-esque type relationship to it, though Carr was 14 years older than Harris. But I do think that it slowly transitioned from that to very much an exchange and a friendship. And I think that Harris got a lot out of their communications as well, as I'll point out in a moment. One of the things that he advised Carr, do you use a mirror? It reverses the picture, but doubles the distance and is a real aid at times, I find. One sees faults in it that direct looking doesn't disclose, and also it leads one to increase the modeling, the depth of the picture. You can see here, these are just both mirror images of very familiar Harris works, Mount Lefroy and North Shore Lake Superior, that depending on how familiar you are with them, can look quite different when you look at them at a mirror image. And I'm sure anybody that's ever seen a photograph of themselves, which is everybody, understands this, like something is just off from how you regularly see yourself in the mirror. And this was a tool that Harris certainly used himself, that we learn a bit about, and that also he shared with Carr. Probably the most famous piece of advice or influence that Harris had on Carr was twofold. One of them was encouragement just in general, and sharing his own sort of experiences with discouragement and with his own lack of confidence in his works. He said, I have learned that when I do a rotten thing, I should start in right away on the next, and it's usually better. I've also learned to keep right on year in, year out, despite the reoccurring sureness that my stuff is pretty damn sad, and again, that is pretty damn good. It's the only way. So that's one of the big things that he certainly continuously in the letters is pushing, is sort of this encouragement. And the other is maybe a little bit more obvious to the outside, and that was an encouragement to progress in her work in terms of the subjects she was working on. And Harris, as I've mentioned, is one that worked through a bunch of subjects and didn't stay on one subject particularly for all too long, was always progressing to the next one. And I think he was eager to encourage Carr to do the same. He was taken with how individual her work was. You have Feeling of the West Coast Beyond Anyone. And he suggests to her in 1929, how about leaving the totems alone for a year or more? I mean, the totem pole is a work of art in its own right, and it's very difficult to use in another form of art. But how about seeking an equivalent for it in the exotic landscape of the island and coast, making your own forms? Create new things from the landscape, houses, steps, benches, and whatnot. Carr didn't seem to be too enamored with this suggestion. It's possible, obviously, that, well, it's not possible. It's clear that Carr's connection to the indigenous villages, to the art that she saw in these villages, to totem poles, seeing them in situ, seeing them in the West Coast landscape, fostered a very different appreciation, a very different connection, and a very different representation for her in terms of what they meant. And it's possible that Harris didn't quite have the same, or it's certainly almost certain that he wouldn't have had the same perspective on it. But I think it's been misconstrued a lot in history that in some way Harris didn't like these totem pole pictures, or that was trying to get her to move on beyond it because he favored very much a sort of de-peopled landscape or something like that, because that's not clearly reflected. He more was responding to what I had just said about her sense of doubting, and I think his own experiences with progress and trying to move forward. What he says is, you worked for a long time doing 50% canvases of totems, then there was this big gap of many years. Now, if you go back to totems, the old ways of seeing they are not good. The old habits will assert themselves. But if you try fresh with new problems, a new approach, a revitalized aim, and try new materials or new ways of seeing them, you will later come back to totems and do new things with them. So this is an earlier picture of totems that is very typical of Carr's work. This one's from 1913. And he just was, I think, trying to give her ideas that he himself was also struggling with about the depiction of, what he saw as critical to his progress as an artist, always finding new subjects to try and learn more about it. And Carr responded, and in 1929, she painted a couple of pictures that were celebrated and still to this day are certainly celebrated, one of which at the time called the Indian Church, now renamed Church at Uquat there in 1929. Harris ended up buying that picture. He loved that picture. He loved that picture so much that Emily Carr got mad at him for stop talking about that damn church. She was frustrated that her best work was behind her in his eyes, but he loved the unity of these works, sort of their singular realization. And it's no surprise. It not entirely about this presentation of a de-peopled landscape that the Group of Seven, I think, have been typified as depicting, because at the time, in the latter half of the 20s, Harris was fairly comfortably depicting not people necessarily, the odd individual, but certainly he was depicting landscapes that were not wilderness ideals. And in the end of the 20s and into the 30s, particularly when into New Hampshire, there almost always were structures there that in some way were a part of the landscape. You got this picture here, Father Point Lighthouse in the National Gallery, which is one of his late landscape works, that really one of his last great big landscape statements. You've got this painting probably from 1927, is probably when he did it based on the dating of the sketch of Coldwell, the ice house there, Ontario Hilltown from the mid-20s. And then he went on a sketching trip to the Gaspé with Jackson, which is also where he got the sketch for the lighthouse. And he depicted some of the villages along the St. Lawrence there as well. So it's no surprise that he would have responded to the church painting that Carr had done and some of these other more unified, in his mind, sort of singular visions that were very individual to her. Likewise, when he was in the Arctic, though he did generally depict landscapes without people in them, he did seem to have some fascination in one of the communities they visited, Pangnertung, where he did love to paint the tents there as part of the landscape. He did experiment in his sketchbooks with paintings of the people, and certainly Jackson on this trip painted a lot of pictures of people in his paintings. It's something that Harris did shy away from, similarly to how he shied away from it in that Glace Bay picture of miners' houses. It didn't seem to be something that he was entirely comfortable with depicting, or didn't inspire what resonated with him for whatever reason. But it makes sense that the works that Carr was producing would have resonated with him. But it doesn't mean he didn't like the totem poles. He describes a 1929 your totem pole I saw at the Ontario Society of Artists show is one of the best things in the show. In fact, there isn't anything in the show as good. That's this picture here. And Harthouse ended up buying that in 1929 at the University of Toronto. I was in Harthouse the other day. Your canvas looks great. I think it's the best picture they own and one of the best things done in the country. It looks far better on the walls of Harthouse than it did in the exhibition. It is completely satisfying, a very genuine, resonant statement. So he was certainly not entirely against these pictures. And though Carr, I think, felt a little misunderstood in what she was trying to depict with them, she did write back to him saying as much as he tried to clarify. It was that I thought and still think a partial holidays from totems would prove of real help to you. The tremendous elusive of what lies behind, obviously Carr's words in her letter. You got in many of the pictures that were in the show here in the peculiar atmospheric conditions of the West Coast that you have in your bones were part and parcel of it. He's just saying if you did too many, you might become dependent on them. Whereas if you do these other subjects, you'll create your own form and can go back and handle the totems with greater surety afterwards. Carr, to some degree, moves on to painting forests more, but certainly doesn't leave the depiction of totems behind entirely. You can see a work like this, Vanquished from 1930, that there are totem poles there in a large, less of the central focus, more of a larger landscape. You can clearly see potentially some of the influence of Harris here in the treatment of light in the sky, or the focusing on that. There's a sense that when Harris is trying to communicate with Carr about moving beyond totems, part of that is him trying to give himself the same advice about moving beyond the crutches that he sees as necessary to transmit a higher truth or idea that he doesn't quite have the tools for yet. he says in his letter to Carr in 1930, he talks about how the spirit of something is what they're trying to communicate. And he sees that both of them trying to communicate the same thing, and that they're using the representational because it provides a home for the spirit. We sense the spirit first and always through the life and forms of nature. So for him, trying to move beyond the forms of the landscape, which he does a few years later when he moves to abstraction, is very similar to, I think, what he was advising her to do with totems, trying to, in his mind, move away from these sort of familiar representations to get at a bigger idea. And certainly he was encouraging of her to try abstraction as well, though she didn't much take to that, it seems, or didn't much enjoy it or find any satisfaction there. She did move more to forests, but also still focused on indigenous subjects as well. This picture from 1931, again, showing some of the perhaps influence of Harris there as well, some of the influence of her work with Mark Tobey in terms of volumetric forms. At the same time, Harris himself is going through his own crisis of subjects. And as I pointed out before, he was reliant on these natural forms he was trying to move from. He did gift one of the works to Carr that he did on his 1930 Arctic expedition. And I just overlaid the color picture of it there in her living room. So she had this picture, which is a sketch for a great canvas in the National Gallery, in her house, and is one of the last big works that he did before he finally was able to sort of push through this. And I think that part of the advice that he was giving Carr about her fluctuations of mood and about the need to progress was very much resonant with himself and his own approach. She would be discouraged. He tells her how you can expect to be discouraged initially. You're dealing with something new. You're going to need to work through it a lot of times before you get to the same comfort level that you were with totem poles. And he talks about how he is sort of searching himself, and he's going back, looking at old work, trying to take up a subject done years back and press forward with it. He's suggesting that she takes a gap and then goes back to tree trunk subjects, give it some space, then try again. These different iterations very much in line with the approaches that he took. And we can see here that the advice that he gave then is reflected in the works. And we don't know exactly when he did these canvases. This is a sketch from Algoma, and he did 3 canvases based on it. This one was done in the early 20s. It's a bit unclear as to when these 2 were done, definitely before he left Canada in 1934, but all based on the same sketch. And he talks about that idea of going back and revisiting these works and trying them again and again with slight variations, trying to get at that underlying spirit. I think go back to one of your first phase subjects, he would say, and do it on another canvas, carrying it as far past the first phase in expression. I think you'll be amazed at the difference in the results. Saying if you're discouraged with what you're working on right now, you'll see your progress. If you're trying to pick something from before, then you'll see how far you've come. And he says, I go back and paint old subjects once a year to get some perspective. And we can see that. This one, of course, in the collection there, the Janag, an Algonquin subject in the middle of the 20s, was a little bit out of pace with what his main focus was in the more austere Lake Superior area by that point. But he still would go back and focus on subjects like that. Certainly in the latter half of the 20s, pictures like this of various areas, probably Temagami or Algonquin, where he would paint, reflect this and enabled him to see how much he had progressed. This 1926 canvas of Grimsby in Ontario in the summer is one of his late sort of final works depicting houses or a semi-urban sort of scene. And really through it, we can see how much he's changed. Likewise here, same subject over a range of years gives wonderful perspective on how his style has changed and where the focus is. And this type of message here in 1932, as Carr really embarks on her own new journey, could easily have been Harris talking to himself. Don't weaken or get discouraged where he once did. If and when that comes, go right to the heart of it, that place, and say, I, Emily Carr, command quiet here. I'm a master of my dwelling, and here there will be new growth, new fruition, no older needs, but the spring of new life. And he's talking about this need that a new vision will emerge. And this has wonderful results for Carr, and not just from this, but at the same time that he's giving this advice, Carr is discovering an entirely new way of expressing herself and painting with oil, thinned out oil on paper, large scale paper sketches. Carr really moves into her final mature period in Victoria. So from 1930-31, the early couple of years of that decade, she really begins to develop this approach. And you can see from a couple of the works, or all three works actually, are oil on paper of the Carr works that are in the collection that you have there at the JNAG, including this one. You can really see a whole new freedom that Carr started to revel in. And I think this not only was encouraged by Harris, but I think also inspired Harris. And I don't think it's a coincidence that around the same time, Harris had his own troubles with his career, and in general, he was going through a large degree of life changes, and he emerged on the other side with a new enthusiasm for abstract painting, essentially totally reinventing himself, much in the way that Carr did here. So these are just a couple of the works that you have in the collection there. Wonderful forest and seascapes. And I want to close just by sort of emphasizing that this wasn't a one-way street. For Harris, these communications obviously were very valuable to him as well. And he talks about in 1933, I feel about my work first as you feel about your work. I looked at my stuff over the other day and found it wanting, sadly lacking. I'm not painting. I'm at a crossroads where the entire problems of lifetime meet. I don't know why I tell you this. Yes, I do. You are the one of the few who will understand completely. So it's very much not just a one-way street here in these communications, and Harris having a crisis in his life, but also particularly in his art around this period before he eventually builds up and moves onto abstraction and is revitalized there, very much finds this consolation in sharing with a fellow like-minded artist like Carr. Finally, in a letter from Carr, there's also a little bit more levity to this exchange here, perhaps. When you refer to movement in space, as I said, Harris was encouraging Carr to try abstraction, or explaining after he really became enthusiastic about it why she might like it as well, or what it meant to him. He says, when you refer to a movement in space that's abstract, a good title for an abstraction, why don't you try just for fun to take the idea and extricate it from the representational? He talks a bit about that, but you can see movement in space, a good title for an abstraction. In the National Gallery, we have a 1936 painting by Harris that's titled Equations in Space. So obviously he was thinking, that's pretty good. That's a pretty good title. I'll just throw that on this painting here. Yeah, it seems to work. So clearly there was a lot going back and forth there. There's much more that could be said about both these artists, and particularly about Carr and the work that she did after the early 1930s and sort of her final stage or her final phase. I don't have the time to go over all that, and certainly there are many who likewise would be able to fill in many, many more gaps of that. But the emphasis of what I wanted to talk about today was just the connection between Harris and like-minded artists that he was contemporaries with. When they transitioned to the Canadian Group of Painters in 1933, they released a statement prior to the conclusion of the Group of Seven saying they've always believed in an art inspired by the country, and that the way in which people will find their own individual expression in art is for the artists to stand on their own feet and by direct experience of the country itself, and in the inexhaustible variety of new and untried themes to produce works of its own time and place. The group has always maintained for themselves and others the right to freedom of expression, believing that only in diversity of outlook will there ever be a widespread interest in the arts of this country. And in that way, I think we can take this idea of the Group of Seven from 1920, which from the intro to their sort of catalog written by Harris, where they talked about the great purpose of landscape art is to make us at home in our country. And we can see the resonance of that with that Cronin article that I opened up this lecture about, which also comes to the conclusion the task of making a home in nature is the forever unfinished life work of our species, and see a parallel between these two things here, including this, I think, contemporary mission to take that initial sort of purpose of the group of seven and expand it. Expand who us is in terms of making us at home in our own country, and expanding what we appreciate and what we recognize as depictions of the multitude of ways that people respond to and connect to their environment and appreciate or value the different components of the socio-ecological systems that we are a part of. So that is all I wanted to say for that lecture, and I would be happy to answer what I'm sure are some questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Alec. That's wonderful.
No problem.
I wonder just before, because I have a lot of questions, but before we dive into those, I wonder if I can ask you, Stu, I just wanted to touch on why is it so rare to find letters? Why are we so lucky to have those? I wonder if you can expand on that.
Who are you asking?
Stu, yeah, I'm asking because you gave us access to some of these letters between Harris and Carr. And so people may not quite understand, why is it so rare to find these letters?
Certainly. Harris was a very private man, very private individual, and he had a policy with correspondence. He would receive a letter and keep it until he replied. After he'd replied, he would destroy the letter. And he asked others to do the same with his correspondence. Fortunately, some didn't, like Emily Carr. But most did, I believe. And I know my mother, for example, had a correspondence with him in the early years between about 34 and 1952. And nothing is left of that communication, of those correspondence. All has been destroyed. So all the letters you'll see, or most of them anyway, will be from Harris. And you won't see very many written to Harris because he destroyed them.
Thank you.
All to do with privacy, I believe. He felt it was personal between whoever he was corresponding with. It wasn't meant for anybody else except the person with whom he was corresponding. So after he'd done the correspondence, get rid of it.
Whoops. And now I'm here talking all about them and betraying the privacy. But unfortunately, it became too historically important to...
Right.
Well, maybe not. But anyway, hopefully, yeah, we haven't revealed anything. I think that Harris comes across very, I must say, very kind and understanding in these letters with Carr. Certainly, they clearly had a very understanding friendship, I think, and much valued by both of them, certainly.
So I'm going to open the questions we have from those in attendance. Someone is making a comment about the MacDonald painting on Lake O'Hara. They say, do you notice the face in MacDonald's painting of Lake O'Hara foreshadowing his afterlife? This is interesting.
No, I haven't, but I'll have to go back and look for that. That sounds fascinating. No, but hey, I mean... We
will look.
Sorry.
No, I was saying I'm going to play this back after and pause it on that section.
Yeah. I forget the exact quote, but it's in one of Lisa Christensen's books, certainly about MacDonald booking something in the upper reaches of Lake O'Hara is where he wanted to spend the afterlife. So perhaps he was trying to manifest that, or in a way, his legacy does live on, forever connected. I got to visit there in the summer, and certainly it was like being in Hollywood, where you get all these like celebrity mountains everywhere, all these viewpoints. We walk like, oh my, that's a MacDonald painting. Oh, that's a Harris painting, right? You just get all these viewpoints there. It's wild how it laid the groundwork. I mean, not for everybody. It's a fascinating place, regardless of your familiarity with that, but it was certainly inspiring.
We have a question about Anne Savage. It says, one of your Anne Savage examples depicted a plow representing agriculture and human manipulation of the landscape. This seems unique for the times. The group of 7 related works, did Harris capture this in other works? What about deforestation captured in paintings?
Yeah, definitely not that often, but there are examples. So Thompson depicted, probably more than anybody else, forestry industry in Algonquin Park, whether it's this large alligator machinery, but then also dams and log booms, etc. Harris did occasionally. Certainly, you see some in Lake Superior when he's depicting fishing villages like Coldwell, where he depicts some of the infrastructure surrounding that. But Carr certainly I got all these books around, but I won't try and search through them. But there are depictions of Carr, from Carr's works, of logged over areas outside of Victoria. She used to paint, and she would call the little sort of rigid, sort of spiky bits, these screamers left over from when a tree was chopped down, and sort of this rather abrupt edge that was left on the stump. So definitely Carr depicted that. And really almost all of Harris's work and many of the other Group of Seven artists' work in Algoma and Lake Superior and the Rockies indirectly depicted forestry, or at least forest fires, because that's what enabled them to get the views that they have, the long expansive views. Many of the places where they painted 80 or 90 or 100 years ago, if we go to that exact same spot, stood on that same patch of ground, you can't see anything, because the trees have all grown up there, so they had access to it because the infrastructure that was because of resource extraction, but also the views were very much shaped by those very industries, even though they weren't explicitly depicted. So I think it's interesting recognizing that allows us to place the works in a different context. And whereas they weren't purposefully trying to depict that necessarily, you can still see a record of Canada's history of resource exploitation and a sort of a country built on this that is echoed in this art as well, even though it's in one way depicting an untouched or wilderness landscape.
That's interesting that you segued over in that direction, because the follow-up question to that was, are changes in biodiversity evident in comparing early works like Harris versus other artists at the same location, including yourself, Alec?
Oh, well, there's lots of differences in the stuff that I do, and there's most in quality but certainly in value. But other than that, yeah, I mean, mostly, obviously, glacier extents and snow coverage is hugely. Fred Varley from the Group 7 painted a lot around Garibaldi, so it's really easy to notice because that's accessible to where I am. I've often noticed differences in the extent of glaciers, which you certainly would see in the Rockies too. Biodiversity, definitely the tree coverage has, as I said, increased a lot. I don't know about the actual composition of biodiversity, like the species richness or anything like that. That'd be hard to tell. Certainly from the generalizations there, but I think it'd be interesting to check out, particularly from Carr's work too. She all the different trees. Yeah.
Harris's 1934 Algoma sketches are almost surreal. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Harris was interested in pushing. Obviously, he was on the verge of abstraction, and he was flirting with abstraction in the 1920s. He did a few purely abstract canvases. I think he was interested in taking a kernel of what he saw as the truth of the world and pushing it as far as he could, including, he's got some really interesting ones from the mid-20s. I showed one of them that are almost this, like, again, this was used to describe their works earlier on in his career, but this like tomato soup style color. It's almost like somebody poured a red glaze all over them, this sort of hot, vibrant red in a couple of his canvases that he did. And interestingly, there's two Algoma canvases that look like that. Both of them have other versions of the same scene done without that red. So obviously he was working through this sort of tonality there. Yeah, other than that, I think, I mean, Harris was very exposed to modern art around the world, and there certainly are more extreme examples going on, Phobos and stuff like that, even Impressionist art and post-Impressionist Van Gogh that he was very familiar with, that even pushed the boundaries of reality beyond what Harris was doing. Certainly, he would have been very aware of that as well.
Thank you. Someone is asking, and this is a huge question, why do you think Harris is one of Canada's favorites?
I don't know. Stu, I mean, I think it resonates. He did achieve, I think, what he was setting out to do with hitting this sort of resonant frequency on this underlying truth. I think that part of it is cultural feedback. I mean, with someone like Thompson, and even to some degree with Carr, there was a very explicit effort by Harris and his contemporaries to really promote this art as iconic. They were very strategic in getting works by Thompson, particularly after Thompson died, into important collections being acquired by the National Gallery. And the same with Carr. Harris was instrumental in arranging the donation of many of her works, the Emily Carr Trust, to the Vancouver Art Gallery, and also negotiated a deal where Emily Carr's works would always be on display at the Vancouver Art Gallery 6 months out of the year. He was critical in preserving the legacy of these artists that he valued so much. And I think by doing so, he also created space where he himself fell into this same sort of celebrated group. There was like the Sampson Matthews project. I mean, there's so many other ways that this has entered into our public collective consciousness. The Sampson Matthews project is a whole other thing, but these silkscreen pictures that were done, that were distributed to banks and to barracks during World War I in association with the National Gallery. There's a wonderful book about that. So they entered into our public consciousness. And then now today, I mean, I know Stew's got a mug there that I saw earlier that's got Harris's painting on it. And you don't need to see them, but I'm wearing socks with Lawren Harris painting on them. So, once it starts to permeate, then familiarity often breeds appreciation. Not always, but often does. And I think there's a lot to, obviously, I think there's a lot to like about it. But so I think it's sort of, a feedback loop, but then also obviously the genuine resonance of the work.
Do you guys have any thoughts on why Harris loved Carr's white church so much?
There's a quote in one of these letters that I won't be able to recall, and I just had to cut it because I didn't have time to put every quote in there. But he talks about it, he just saw it as a single unified. He actually said it's hard to explain. If I could find the quote, it would be great. But he says, if you give me a moment, he does say that it's a bit hard to explain, but it's sort of this unified depiction that is not too forceful. If I just search here, he does say that when he's back from Europe, I would rather have the church painting more than anything he saw in Europe. When we got back, it looked better than ever. It's one swell thing. And then, frankly, I still think the church is the best yet. Of course, I've lived with it for quite a while, but it never for a moment loses its stimulus. It has a great wealth of variety and yet is more concentrated than the recent pictures, somehow not so intense. This is difficult to put into words. So clearly, I can't explain why he loved it so much, if he couldn't necessarily explain why he loved it so much. But I do think that there was this unifying factor that maybe at the time in her works, he didn't see resonate as much. And that might be due to his slight disconnect with the way that he saw totem poles from how Carr saw them. He saw them as singular art on their own, not seeing them in context. I don't know if you've ever been to, say, the British Museum, or they have got totem poles there somewhat extremely abruptly in sort of the lobby cafe area there. And likewise, if you visit the wonderful Museum of Anthropology here, seeing totem poles in that sense, really, you get a sense of them as art, but it is very divorced from the context, which is how Carr experienced them.
As an aside on that one, if I remember the story correctly, my mother always mentioned that it used to be hanging, I believe it was in the dining room in their home. And people used to come by and admire the different works. Well, someone came in and admired the church very much. Harris sold it to him on the spot, took the money and sent it to Emily Carr. So really? As much as he loved the work, somebody else saw something in it, admired it, liked it, wanted it. So he sold it. So it was, again, promoting other artists, and Emily got the money twice.
There you go. And I do believe then it was Charles Band owned it for a while, who was a very prominent collector of Harris's works, and then also several other Carr works. And he did leave it to the Art Gallery of Ontario. I do believe part of that, in all the letters when Carr talks about, or when Harris talks about wanting to buy that church painting, he all says, I'll only buy it if the gallery, Art Gallery of Toronto, doesn't want to buy it. I think that that's a better place for it. And if I do buy it, I will bequeath it to the gallery later, which tends to be what he did. He had four Tom Thompson paintings. he donated all of those, one to the National Gallery, I believe, and then 3 sketches to the Art Gallery of Toronto at the time, Art Gallery of Ontario. Likewise, there's Jackson's in the collection here at Vancouver Art Gallery that were donated by Harris in the 40s. So he seemed to be very, very enthusiastic about these works being continued to be appreciated and the significance of them.
I have a question here that's asking if you guys can share how Harris's late abstract paintings were received in their day.
Not as enthusiastically.
Yeah, true.
I think all of his abstracts, people, there's a letter somewhere, and again, I'm not going to spend all my time today just pulling through all these other references as much as I'd like to. That would not be very exciting television. But where Bess, his wife, who was publishing a book on Harris in 1969, just prior to actually both of their, just at the end of both their lives, she talks about hopefully this will push the public consciousness to recognize Harris as more than just the group of 7. So I think in the same way that Carr perhaps pushed back on Harris being so focused on the church painting, and sort of she did have this aggression in her being like, I'm more than, stop talking about this stupid painting. Like, it's just one thing I did a while ago. I don't want to feel like my best days are behind me. I do think Harris would have resonated with that, certainly during his abstract phase, where people were very interested in his landscape work and didn't have nearly as much interest. So there were some that that did, certainly respond to it, but generally, obviously, much less well known right now.
I think Harris was painting for himself. He was fortunate that he didn't have to sell to live. He didn't have to sell his works to live. So he could paint what he liked, what he wanted, to please himself. So I agree with Alec. I don't think the works were very well received initially, but he really didn't care. He was still doing what he wanted, when he wanted, how he wanted. So it made it easy for him, where it may not have been as easy for someone else.
Thank you. We have a couple comments talking about, when is the book coming out, guys? So I want to take a second and just encourage everyone to, that you can visit the Lawren Harris inventory by going on their website, which is lawrenharrisinventory.com. I believe, Alec, you mentioned that's where any updates would be posted as far as how the project is going and progress.
Yeah, so there's a few. I would love to write a book on some of the stuff or something like that. That is a few years out. I have a pressing PhD dissertation that is a little bit, has to be a priority, which is on entirely different stuff. But at the future, if I feel the weight of a large writing project missing from my shoulders, no, I certainly would be very helpful to do that. In the interim, though, hoping to put up some essays, some written version of some of the stuff that I just get to touch on in these talks on the website there. So hopefully, even though it'll be a while before we get up a huge number of explorable sort of catalog images there, hopefully there will be some information there and essays such as this that would be really cool to check out, I think.
I'm not selling anything, Sonia, and I don't get a commission, but there is a book that people may be interested in. It's more about his life than his art. What Alec and I are working on is an inventory of the art. This includes a number of pictures, but a lot about his life. And it's quite well done, and somebody or some of your people may enjoy. Have a read.
Thank you for that recommendation, Stu.
It's called Inward Journey by James King.
Somebody is asking, this is probably a really broad question and maybe something that we can get from some recommendations later and post on our website. But someone is asking, can you recommend a comprehensive book of this period of Canadian art? It's a big question.
There's lots of books about the Group of Seven, picture books. So Peter Mellon wrote a book in 1970 about the Group of Seven that's pretty good. The Art for a Nation. I do have sort of props here. This Group of Seven Art for a Nation catalog by Charlie Hill is a wonderful book about the entire overview of the Group of Seven period. And then also there's a Charlie Hill book that's somewhere else around here. I won't run and get it, called Canadian Painting in the 30s. That's also a great book. Charlie Hill was the senior curator of Canadian art at the National Gallery for decades. Is an unbelievable resource of knowledge on all this stuff. I've learned a ton from reading his stuff, and from if I ever have a big question about stuff or wondering if I'm going the right path on something, saying, you know, it's the date of this painting, should I be questioning it or is it locked? You know, I will usually email or sometimes email Charlie and say, you know, should I question this, or do you know, because he's had access to all this stuff for many years, the archives, his work. I do hope sometime in the future, when travel becomes a little bit more blah, 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 that I can have a chance to access some of the amazing resources he put together. So Art for a Nation is a great book. There's a Harris book from a 1978 show, Urban Scenes of Wilderness Landscapes, that covers his landscape period really well. And, you know, there's lots.
Great. Somebody is curious about the paintings behind you. Are they yours? I'm thinking that might be directed to Alec, but I do see, Stu, that you have some nice work behind you as well. So maybe we'll start with Alec.
Yes, these are mine. Yeah. And these are all Harris pencil sketches.
Beautiful.
All of which were in last week's show.
Nice. I have regional artist behind me. She's based out of London right now by the name of Danelle Dupuis. And then a lot of thanks in the comments, and we're just about up on our time. So I just want to say thank you so much to both of you. This wraps up our lecture series for winter spring. Thank you so much for contributing such a wealth of knowledge to expanding the conversation around our exhibition. And I have no doubt that we'll continue to be in touch.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sonia, for hosting this and for asking us to come speak. It's been a pleasure to have the opportunity to share some of this stuff, and hopefully it's been interesting to others. I certainly loved having the opportunity to do that, and I greatly look forward to hopefully visiting the gallery there in the future at some point. I would love to see those works that I've now spent a lot of time looking very, very closely at on my computer screen in person. So,
and thank you for teaching me about the work that we have in our collection as well. I really appreciate it. It's been really lovely actually to go back into the building and get so close and think, if I can't go to another gallery, I get this chance to look so closely at the real thing. And it's been a wonderful relief from everything.
And again, if anybody has a Harris work that we may not know about, yes, we'd be very, very, very pleased to see whatever they have.
Definitely. There's a form on the website there that contacts, goes right into my email, basically, that we are always looking for more works. There's a lot of unknowns still, a lot of big questions. I mean, there was one work today that I pointed out. We don't know where it is or what conditions it's in or anything like that, but certainly we are always eager to see new works, and always the highlight of a day. So, except when we get a chance to talk about it like this, then this is the highlight. So, thank you very much to everybody for your attention. Hopefully, I look forward to the chance to visiting the gallery in the future and all that. So, thank you.
Thank you, Sonia.
Thank you. Good night, everybody. Thank you for being here.
Bye-bye.